There is a place on this planet where the forest makes its own weather, where 5.5 million square kilometers of trees pull water from the earth, lift it through their roots and trunks and leaves, and release it back into the sky. 20 billion tons of water vapor every single day, more than the Amazon River carries to the sea. It is not a metaphor. It is a measurable, documented atmospheric phenomenon. And it is the reason that what happens inside this forest does not stay inside this forest. Now imagine it begins to change. Not overnight, not in a single catastrophic moment, but gradually the way a tide goes out, so slowly that the change is easy to miss, until one day you look up and realize the horizon is different from what it used to be. This documentary does not claim to know the future. What it does is take the science seriously. It asks a question that a growing number of Earth system researchers are asking, carefully, methodically, with models and field data and decades of observation. What would happen if the Amazon rainforest collapsed? The year is 2087. A researcher steps off a small aircraft onto cracked, pale Earth. The air is dry, not desert dry, but thin. The kind of dry that feels wrong when you know what this place used to be. There are still plants here, still birds, still insects moving through the scrub. But the canopy is gone. Where there were once trees 200 feet tall, draped in bromeliads and orchids and the permanent mist of their own exhalation, there is now open sky, sparse grasses, scattered low shrubs adapted to sun and drought, a landscape that is alive but unrecognizable to anyone who knew the Amazon before. This is not a prediction. It is a scenario, one constructed from existing climate models, deforestation data, and ecological threshold research. Scientists use scenarios not as prophecy, but as structured imagination, a way of following the logic of a system to see where it might lead. So let us follow the logic. To understand what could change the Amazon, you first have to understand what makes it what it is. Most forests receive rainfall. The Amazon does something more remarkable. It participates in creating it. Picture the process this way. Every tree in the Amazon is, among other things, a pump. Its roots draw moisture from deep in the soil. That water travels upward through the trunk into branches into millions of leaves, and there, through tiny pores called stomata, it is released as invisible water vapor into the air. Above the canopy, one tree does this quietly, imperceptibly. But multiply that process across 400 billion trees, across 5.5 million square kilometers, and something remarkable emerges at scale. The Amazon generates what researchers sometimes call flying rivers, vast invisible corridors of water vapor that move westward through the atmosphere, driven by prevailing winds before eventually condensing and falling, again as rain. These flying rivers water not just the forest itself, but agricultural regions far beyond it. The Cerrado, the Pantanal, the soy fields and cattle pastures of Mato Grosso, the river systems that feed hydroelectric dams powering Brazilian cities. Research suggests they even influence rainfall patterns as far away as the Rio de la Plata basin, thousands of kilometers to the south. The forest, in other words, is not a passive recipient of climate. It is an active participant in generating it, and that is precisely what makes it vulnerable in a way that a simpler ecosystem might not be. In ecology, a tipping point is not simply a moment of dramatic change. It is something more precise and more unsettling, a threshold beyond which a system loses the capacity to maintain itself in its current state and begins reorganizing around a new equilibrium. Research from institutions including Brazil's National Institute for Space Research, the Potsdam Institute for Climate, impact research, and teams at the University of Exeter suggest that the Amazon may have such a threshold, a point at which enough forest has been removed that the remaining trees can no longer sustain the moisture cycle that keeps the whole system alive. Current models place that threshold, and scientists are careful to note significant uncertainty in these estimates. Somewhere between 20 and 25% total deforestation of the original Amazon basin. As of the early 2020s, between 17 and 18% had been cleared or significantly degraded. The numbers feel close. But what makes the research genuinely complex is that deforestation is not the only variable. It is one thread in a web of interacting pressures, and it is the interaction between them that climate scientists say demands attention. Rising regional temperatures reduce the efficiency of photosynthesis and increase the water demand of trees already under stress. Extended dry seasons, which research indicates have been measurably lengthening across the southern and eastern Amazon over recent decades, raise tree mortality and fire frequency. And forest fragmentation, the breaking of continuous canopy into isolated patches separated by cleared land, disrupts the internal atmospheric dynamics that move moisture through the system. Fragmented forest edges dry out faster. They are more exposed to wind and heat. They lose water they cannot recover. A forest at its edges is not the same as a forest at its heart, and as the edges multiply, the heart begins to shrink. These pressures do not operate independently. They compound each other. A drought weakens trees. Weakened trees are more likely to burn. Burned areas cannot evapotranspirate. Less evapotranspiration means less local rainfall. Less rainfall means longer dry seasons. Longer dry seasons weaken more trees. Scientists call this a feedback loop. And what the research suggests, not with certainty but with increasing seriousness, is that if enough of these loops activate simultaneously, the Amazon's self-sustaining moisture system could begin to unravel from the inside. What researchers describe as savannization is not a sudden transformation. It is a gradual ecological drift, a slow-motion restructuring of a system that, once set in motion, may be difficult to reverse. The southern and eastern Amazon, already the driest, most deforested, and most fragmented portions of the basin, are considered most vulnerable in current models. These areas could, in some scenarios, begin shifting towards something resembling the Cerrado, Brazil's interior, savanna, an ecosystem that is biologically rich by global standards but fundamentally different in structure, in water output, and in the services it provides to the atmosphere. Wetter, more intact regions in the northwestern Amazon, research suggests, could retain their forest character for significantly longer, potentially for generations, even under moderate stress scenarios. The transition, if it occurs, would not be uniform. It would be patchy, contested, and slow, playing out not in years but in decades. Climate models offer a plausible and, again, not inevitable timeline for such a transition. In the first 0 to 5 years following a significant threshold breach, scientists suggest we might see accelerating tree mortality in the most stressed regions, declining local rainfall, and the early stages of self-reinforcing feedback loops. Between 5 and 15 years, the forest's resilience could diminish across wider areas. Forest dieback events might increase in frequency and geographic scale. Rainfall reductions, research indicates, could begin affecting regions well beyond the forest boundary. Between 15 and 30 years, portions of the southern and eastern Amazon could stabilize into a new ecological state. Not a dead landscape, but a different one, with different rainfall patterns, different carbon dynamics, and different relationships to the systems that depend on it. The Amazon did not arrive at its current form quickly. It has been shaped across millions of years of coevolution between soil, water, atmosphere, and life. What science is beginning to understand, with growing clarity and growing humility about the limits of that understanding, is that the system sustaining the Amazon is more circular and potentially more sensitive at its edges than previously recognized. A forest that breathes water into the sky is one of the most complex living machines on Earth. What happens when that machine begins to breathe differently is a question that reaches far beyond any forest. Because the Amazon does not exist in isolation, its moisture feeds rivers, its carbon dynamics interact with the global atmosphere, its rainfall shapes the agriculture of an entire continent, and the systems downstream from the Amazon, ecological, hydrological, economic, are woven into the lives of hundreds of millions of people who may never have set foot in the forest themselves. In the phases that follow, we trace those connections. We follow the water as it diminishes. We follow the heat as it spreads. We follow the disruption through soils and supply chains and shipping routes to ask as carefully and as honestly as the science allows, what would a world without a functioning Amazon actually look like? Before any impact reaches the wider world, it arrives first in the places closest to the forest itself. South America is not simply adjacent to the Amazon. In significant ways, it is built around it. The flying rivers that the Amazon generates do not disappear at political borders. They move through the atmosphere according to physics. And when they weaken, the consequences are felt across an interconnected continental system. Research indicates that reduced Amazonian evapotranspiration could meaningfully decrease rainfall across wide areas of Brazil, Bolivia, Paraguay, and northern Argentina. These are not marginal regions. They include some of the most agriculturally productive land on the planet, territory responsible for a substantial share of global soy, corn, beef, and sugar production. The Paraná River Basin, which drains much of central southern South America and feeds major hydroelectric systems among the largest in the world, is particularly sensitive to changes in upstream rainfall. Climate models suggest that reduced Amazon moisture recycling could decrease river flows across this basin, with implications for both water availability and electricity generation. Simultaneously, the Cerrado, Brazil's interior savanna, already one of the most biologically diverse savannas on Earth, could experience altered rainfall timing and reduced annual totals. Growing seasons that currently align with predictable wet and dry cycles could become less predictable. Crops calibrated for those cycles would face new stress. Rivers fed by Andean glaciers and Amazonian rainfall would face pressure from two directions simultaneously: reduced forest moisture from the east and accelerated glacial retreat from the west. Research suggests that river systems in Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia could experience more pronounced seasonal variability, higher flood risk during rainfall events, deeper dry season low flows. The regional picture in scientific terms is not one of uniform decline. It is one of increasing variability, decreasing predictability, and mounting pressure on systems calibrated for a different atmospheric baseline. When the forest changes, the continent changes with it. Not all at once and not all in the same way, but in ways that accumulate. The Amazon's relationship with global climate is not straightforward, and science is careful about the claims it makes here. What research does indicate with reasonable confidence is that the Amazon currently plays a significant role in global carbon dynamics. The living forest stores an estimated 150 to 200 billion tons of carbon. A degraded or transitioning Amazon would not release this carbon instantaneously. Forest dieback is a slow process, and the timeline and mechanism of any carbon release would depend heavily on factors including fire frequency, soil conditions, and the nature of whatever vegetation replaced the original forest. But over decades, a significantly degraded Amazon could shift from being a net carbon sink, absorbing more carbon than it releases, to a net carbon source. Research suggests this transition may, in some regions, already be underway. Climate scientists do not speak of the Amazon's influence on global temperature in isolation. They speak of it as one significant variable within a complex planetary system. Changes in the Amazon would interact with Arctic sea ice dynamics, with monsoon patterns in West Africa and South Asia, with jet stream behavior over the North Atlantic. The Amazon is not the world's thermostat, but it is one hand on a dial that affects more than those who live beneath its canopy. Among the more studied potential interactions, research indicates that changes in Amazon moisture output could influence the positioning of the intertropical convergence zone, a major driver of tropical rainfall across multiple continents. Shifts in this system, even modest ones, could alter wet season timing in West Africa, influence monsoon precipitation in parts of South Asia, and interact with drought patterns in the Caribbean and Central America. These are projections with significant uncertainty ranges. They are not uniform outcomes. They represent the kinds of possibilities that Earth system scientists believe should be understood before they are tested. Of all the downstream consequences that researchers discuss when modeling Amazon disruption, the ones with the most direct and measurable pathways to global human systems run through agriculture, and specifically through the global production and trade of animal protein. The connection is not abstract. It is logistical, economic, and deeply embedded in how the modern food system works. Brazil is one of the world's largest beef producers and exporters, with a herd of more than 200 million head, the largest commercial cattle herd on Earth. Much of this production takes place on pasture land carved from or adjacent to the Amazon and Cerrado biomes. These pastures depend on rainfall, the same rainfall that research suggests is partly generated by the forest itself. In a scenario where Amazon-driven moisture recycling weakens significantly, the southern and eastern pasture zones, already the driest, would face longer and more severe dry seasons. Pasture productivity declines under drought stress. Carrying capacity, the number of cattle a given area of land can sustainably support, decreases. Ranchers face a narrowing set of options: reduce herd size, invest in costly supplemental irrigation, or accept declining productivity. Research indicates that sustained pasture degradation at scale would put measurable upward pressure on beef prices, not through any single dramatic event, but through the quiet arithmetic of reduced supply, meeting consistent or growing global demand. But the cattle story is inseparable from a second story: soy. The Amazon region and its surrounding biomes produce a substantial share of the world's soy, a crop that is, in global terms, less a food for humans than a feedstock for animals. Approximately 70 to 75% of the world's soy harvest is processed into animal feed, primarily for poultry, pigs, and farmed fish. Brazil alone accounts for roughly a third of global soy exports. In a scenario where rainfall decreases and growing season variability increases, soy yields would come under stress, not uniformly and not immediately, but progressively, in ways that compound across seasons. Reduced soy availability increases soy prices. Increased soy prices increase the cost of poultry feed. Increased poultry feed costs increase the price of chicken, a protein source that lower-income populations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America depend on as their primary affordable meat. The feed cost transmission mechanism is well documented in agricultural economics. A 10% increase in soy meal prices does not stay in the soy sector. It moves through the food system, carried by the biology of industrial animal production, which requires continuous feed inputs to function. Poultry and pig operations that cannot absorb higher feed costs reduce production. Reduced production tightens supply. Tightened supply raises consumer prices. The populations most exposed to this chain are those with the least flexibility. Countries that import significant proportions of their animal protein, that have limited domestic feed production alternatives, and where food expenditure represents a large share of household income. Research in food systems economics suggests that sustained commodity price increases of the kind that could follow significant Amazonian disruption would not affect all nations equally. Countries with diversified agricultural sectors and strong trade relationships would have more options for adaptation. Countries dependent on a narrow range of imported commodities would have fewer. Corn, another major feed grain significantly produced in South America, follows a similar logic. Brazil and Argentina together represent a major share of global corn exports. Rainfall disruption affecting either or both of these export corridors would reverberate into global feed markets with measurable speed, given how tightly integrated and inventory lean modern commodity markets tend to operate. The aquaculture sector, which has become an increasingly important source of global protein over recent decades, is also embedded in this system. Farmed salmon in Norway, farmed tilapia in Egypt, farmed shrimp in Vietnam, all are raised on feed that contains significant proportions of soy meal and fish meal. A sustained increase in soy prices would not leave aquaculture costs unaffected. The forest feeds the rain feeds the pasture feeds the cattle. The cattle feed a world that may not fully understand how far the roots of its food system actually reach. When physical systems change, political systems feel it, though rarely in simple or predictable ways. The geopolitical consequences of significant Amazonian disruption would not produce a clean map of winners and losers. They would produce a more ambiguous and layered rearrangement of pressures, dependencies, and strategic considerations, the kind that tends to accumulate quietly before becoming visible. Some agricultural regions outside South America could see increased demand for their exports under scenarios where Brazilian production capacity declines. The United States Corn Belt, Canadian prairies, and the agricultural breadbasket regions of Ukraine and southern Russia produce significant shares of global feed grains. A sustained reduction in South American supply would increase the strategic and economic value of these production zones. But increased value also means increased exposure. Nations that pivot toward alternative suppliers would take on new dependencies, new points of vulnerability in their supply chains. The diversification of one risk can introduce another. Countries with significant infrastructure investments tied to South American agricultural exports, port facilities, rail corridors, financing arrangements, would face complex recalibrations. The infrastructure of the modern food trade is not easily redirected. It is built for specific flows, and changing those flows takes time, capital, and political coordination. Water security would emerge as a more acute strategic consideration across the broader South American region. Nations sharing river basins, the Paraná, the Paraguay, the Amazon itself, already navigate complex multilateral water agreements. Under scenarios of reduced river flow and increased seasonal variability, the pressure on these agreements would intensify. Research in water diplomacy suggests that shared scarcity, tends to make existing institutional relationships both more important and more fragile simultaneously. What large-scale agricultural disruption in South America could do, in some scenarios over decades, is contribute to the conditions under which migration thresholds are reached in specific communities, rural areas, where livelihoods are directly tied to rainfall-dependent agriculture, where no alternative income exists, and where municipal services are already strained. When the systems that quietly underpin human civilization begin to shift, the politics that follow are rarely simple and rarely fast enough. Science does not offer a single image of what a world significantly altered by Amazon disruption would look like. It offers a range of possibilities, some more likely than others under different assumptions, all of them dependent on variables that remain genuinely uncertain. What research does allow is a description of directions of change, the ways in which existing systems would be under pressure, and the kinds of adaptations that individuals, communities, and nations would likely attempt. Agricultural systems globally would face increased pressure to expand production in regions currently less utilized, including parts of sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and high-latitude North America and Russia, where warming temperatures might extend growing seasons even as other regions face stress. Breeding programs for drought-tolerant crop varieties, already underway at agricultural research institutions globally, would become more strategically significant. Investment in irrigation efficiency, in soil carbon management, and crop diversification would shift from prudent to urgent in affected regions. The global soy and feed markets, facing structural pressure, would likely accelerate research into alternative protein sources for animal feed, including insect meal, algae-based proteins, single-cell proteins derived from microbial fermentation, and others. For the Amazon region itself, the scenario space includes both significant degradation and significant recovery, depending on land use decisions, climate trajectories, and restoration efforts. Research indicates that the Amazon has demonstrated meaningful capacity for regeneration under the right conditions, and that degraded land, if allowed to recover, can rebuild ecological function over decades, though not necessarily to its original state. Science is most honest when it describes the shape of its own uncertainty, and the Amazon is a place where that uncertainty is both vast and consequential. We began with a question, not a certainty, not a warning. A question posed the way science poses its hardest questions, with rigor, with humility, and with the recognition that the answer matters enough to ask carefully. The Amazon rainforest is not simply a biome. It is a machine of almost incomprehensible complexity, one that moves water, sequesters carbon, regulates temperature, and sustains a web of life that took millions of years to assemble. It is also a place where people live, where economies are embedded, and where the future is being negotiated in real time. What the science suggests, without claiming to predict, is that the systems downstream from the Amazon are more connected to it than they appear in everyday life. That the water in a rainfall event over an Argentine soybean field, or the cost of a kilogram of chicken in a Jakarta market, or the flow of a river powering a city in Paraguay, may carry within it some trace of what happens inside. 5.5 million square kilometers of forest. The scenarios explored in this documentary are speculative. They are grounded in published research and climate modeling, but they are not forecasts. They are attempts to take the logic of interconnected systems seriously, to follow consequences where they lead, and to be honest about the limits of what anyone can know. The Amazon is still here, still generating its flying rivers, still pulling water from the earth and lifting it into the sky. Whether it continues to do so, at what scale, in what form, and for how long, is one of the most consequential open questions of this century. And it is, in the end, a question that reaches far beyond the forest itself. It reaches into the food on a table, the water in a river, the air above a continent, and the slower, quieter calculations of a civilization trying to understand what it depends on before it finds out the hard way. Thank you for watching.